What do you think it is about the library?
It's where the books live. Like, it's just, you get to go to the book's house.
That is the perfect tagline for libraries.
It's really
Libraries.
sweet.
It's where the books live. I can already
where
see the
books
commercial.
live. Yeah, a lovely community for books.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do. I'd like to know the things that specifically make you.
Hey, I'm Tim Barnes. You are the genre, and in every episode of this show, I ask a great new guest about the first genre that inspired them, the first craft that they pursued, and how they feel about that first pursuit now. In this episode, I'm talking to the Center for Brooklyn History's chief historian, Dominique Jean-Louis, about her early love of libraries and how that bridged into her career as a historian. And speaking of, history, this conversation was recorded in the past. So some of the things discussed are just now coming to fruition. Historically, episodes have come out on Mondays. Then with season 2, I unofficially transitioned that release schedule to Wednesdays. And this week, I delayed even on that. It's coming out on a beautiful, hopefully, Thursday. It's been a long month of what I'm sure will be a long 4 years. But it's also the month that I turned 36. So there's that. Let's blame the delay on my birthday, shall we? Dominique Jean-Louis received her BA in Comparative Ethnic Studies from Columbia University, where she first developed her interest in researching race and education in New York City. And I wanted to find out how someone who has the coolest job title in the world got that job title. We'll find out all that and more in this episode. Enjoy.
I'm not particular, but Jean-Louis is the correct pronunciation, but I'm not hung up on pronunciation.
Okay. Dominique Jean-Louis.
Yes, that's right.
Do you often get like, fancy? Do you ever get that reaction?
Sometimes. Well, it's funny because if it's one of those, if you know, you know. If people are familiar with Haitian names, they're often like, oh, you're Haitian. And if they're not, they're like, oh, it's very fancy. I once had an appointment, like a blind appointment with someone who showed up to my office, and I was like, oh, I think you're here to see me. And he's like, no, I'm looking for some French fella. So close.
That's amazing. Well, you have one of the coolest job titles that I can imagine. You're chief historian for the Center for Brooklyn History.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a cool job title and it's a cool job. I'm pretty lucky. Yeah.
Is it the type of title that makes the childhood version of yourself excited?
I mean, to be honest, the childhood version of myself is much more geeked about the fact that it's at a library than the title itself.
Okay.
And it's long-winded, but I often like to say the chief historian of the Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library, because to me, that bit is the coolest bit about the job, because I was in love with libraries for much longer than I have been a history person.
Nice. And the description of it is somehow cooler than the title. You are the institutional scholar for Kings County lore. Kings County is a part of Brooklyn that I live in. As someone from California who started doing comedy in Chicago and moved to New York in 2016, I don't know if being a black gentrifier is a thing, but
I've heard some people say that it's a thing. They were playing around with the term like gentrification for a while.
Okay.
Like you're one of the people, but you're also a gentrifier, so you're a gentrifier. Brooklyn. And Kings County is all of Brooklyn. So if you're in Brooklyn, you're in Kings County.
Okay.
Which is fascinating. I like the use of lore in my job description. I think that's always a good sign when your job involves lore.
Yes,
I'm very on board with that.
And are you from New York?
Not originally. So my parents are both from Haiti, and they both immigrated to the New York area. So my dad's family immigrated to Queens and my mom's to Jersey City. And I grew up in southern New Jersey, like in the farms part of Jersey, but we still had a lot of family in Queens. So I spent a lot of my childhood coming up to New York City. That's where I learned to double Dutch and all those things. And so I moved here as quickly as I could. I moved here from college and never left and never will.
So do you feel that there is some sort of some biometrical, I'm just putting words together, some biometrical rule, something that is felt when people agree that you are a Brooklynite or a New Yorker?
I definitely do it. I always, you have to let native New Yorkers have their thing. Like if you are born and raised here, you are a special kind of New Yorker in a way that I will never be. But I also feel deeply like I feel like I've earned my stripes to call myself a New Yorker. I've been here more than half my life. And I definitely think it's a title that you can earn. But yeah, if people say you have to be born here to be a New Yorker, then fair enough. That is, and I can't escape the fact that my roots are in fact from New Jersey. But yes, I definitely feel like there's a pull here. I actually don't live in Brooklyn. Controversially, I live in Manhattan.
Wow.
But it means that I walk across the Brooklyn Bridge probably more than most people. And it never loses its magic. Like I've done it hundreds of times and there's still something about crossing that bridge and seeing the whole city that feels like, yup, this is the right place. I'm supposed to be here. And without getting too deep into it, speaking of lore, there's some interesting family lore about my great-grandmother tried to immigrate here via Ellis Island because Ellis Island closed in 1952. And so anyone who came in here after that point, comes in via JFK or something. They don't do the whole Ellis Island, holding area thing. But she tried to come in 1919 and was denied entry. We're not exactly sure why, but, all signs point to the fact that she couldn't read or write. She was a dark-skinned Black woman traveling alone. They just, for whatever reason, declared her an undesirable candidate for immigration and sent her back to Haiti.
Oh, my God.
And when you cross the Brooklyn Bridge, you can see Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. And it's so schmoopy of me, but literally every time I cross the bridge, I look over and I think, Larsina, I did it, girl. Like, I'm so sorry. You didn't get the life you wanted, the life you picked. I mean, 1919, she would have come here and maybe been around all those Harlem Renaissance people. I mean, 1920s Brooklyn, New York, Harlem was such a special time that she tried to be a part of and was denied. And it took a little less than 100 years, but I made it, and I like to think I'm doing it for both of us.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. How often do you get caught up though in this concept of? I feel like it's getting very philosophical right off the bat. Of
Don't worry, let's do it.
Do you because when I think about these things, I'm like, well, would I exist had
Oh, I think about that all the time. Like that was before she had my grandfather. I certainly wouldn't have existed if she came and got to be this fantastic. According to all the family stories, she was this really go-getter, interesting, take no bull kind of lady. And so she would have had a very different path, not like, an unwed mother if she had been able to come here first. So in one way, I'm grateful. But in the other way, I'm like, man, I wish she had gotten her chance. She probably would have done quite a lot. So, but it is interesting because I think that does, in a weird way, give me skin in the game. Like I love New York because it's interesting and it's got a great history and there's literally always something new to learn. But I also like it because no matter what story I'm researching, you kind of think about how this could have been me or how this could have dovetailed with my family history if things had gone a different way. And so I think it makes you feel the stakes a little bit more when you do have some kind of tie.
I think it's interesting also that you're in this position in a city that moves very fast. In any city that moves very fast, to be focused on history has to be an oddity in a certain way.
Oh, for sure. But it's funny because I like to think that doing New York City history also means that you do it in a different way. You have to be a little bit more both quick thinking and I think also creative. And, being a public historian specifically, I have to do history in such a way that accounts for the fact that people here are busy. They don't have time to sit around and read a super long label. I mean, I say that, please don't judge me when my next exhibition opens and there's really long labels. But for instance, I'm working on an exhibition that's opening in January that is in a subway station, and it's like a decommissioned old newsstand, and we're covering it with history and old photographs, which is really cool. But it was also really interesting in the design process and in the writing process to think about the fact that it's a subway station. People are either trying to run and make the train or hurry home from wherever they're coming back from. And so you want to invite people to take a moment and pause and think about history a little bit, but you also want to deliver it in such a way that even if they're moving fast, they got places to be, that they still have a chance to, get some history, learn something real fast on the fly. Maybe they come back and read another panel the next day. But a lot of the work of history is sitting down with the evidence, thinking through ideas, letting the ideas connect. But I think when you're doing New York City history, you also have to think about translating it to a lot of different kinds of audiences and also a lot of different kinds of people that are busy in very many ways. And so I think New York City history, depending, because you also have those super long, like Rick Burns or Ken Burns documentaries about New York. So everyone's got a different pace.
Well, I like that you call them Rick Burns, I think.
Well, there's two of them. They're brothers. And they both make movies.
That's true, yeah.
I always forget which one does which movies. I think it's Ken Burns that has the New York one.
Yeah. Well, I think they should just unite. They should just meld into one filmmaker called Sick Burns. And,
different kind of movie, very different kind of documentary. Although New York has such a cool history of like feuding siblings that I kind of would love it if they also like didn't collab and never did work together and, worked against each other. Because I also think there's something very, very New York about that too.
Avoiding falling down the rabbit hole of feuding siblings in New York, because that is fascinating. It's like you should make a documentary about that. But on this idea that you suggested that you agree with, that you do feel that there's a point in which you earn becoming a Brooklynite or a New Yorker. And also that's so tied to just American history in general, this sense of like at some point you earn being an American, at some point you earn being a Black American. There's some elements of that as well.
Starting the diaspora wars now. But no, I think, and, much more eloquent people than me have opined on this. I think it's like E.B. White that talks about like there are three kinds of New Yorkers. They're the ones that aren't from here and come here seeking something, the people who work here but don't live here, and they're the ones who are kind of contributing to the ongoing thrum of the city. And then, of course, the born and raised people who are the lifeblood, who kind of keep the continuity going. So other people have opined on that. And I think now that I've been here, through college age and seen my friends kind of settle here as young people and either choose to stay or choose to move away, I'm coming to a place where I think about earning your New Yorker status as, are you getting to a point where you're not just taking, but you're contributing? That I think if you're born and raised here, just being here, you're contributing your presence, you're contributing that sense that New York is a place where someone can be from. That's your contribution. But I think if you arrive somewhat later, it's then incumbent upon you to not just enjoy it and eat the great food and see the great sights, but contribute something to it so that you are part of it and you're not just, taking from it. But that's just my opinion. I don't think that's official.
I feel like that's a good transition into the core three questions of the show, because I want to know, what bucket did you initially consider yourself to be in terms of your want to be a New Yorker?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I think, I know the larger point is about genres and things. Very much I thought I was going to be a journalist. I was, editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, and I think they showed me at like baby journalism camp, that movie Shattered Glass, about that guy who would like make up stories at the New Yorker, I think. And I was so into like, yes, I'm going to write the news as it is. And then quickly realized when I got to college that the part of journalism I actually liked was the research. It was kind of the work you do before you start reporting, of learning everything you can. And then, you do your boot leather thing. But I actually didn't love talking to people. I loved doing the research before talking to people. And it turns out that looks a lot like what a historian does, which is do a ton of research and make a story depending on the kind of historian you are, without ever having to really talk to people. And I think if you're not necessarily, if you're shy sometimes, or, are better doing the research than in the moment, then maybe your best chance is being a historian instead of a journalist. So I definitely, it took me a minute to get to history for sure.
What was the first, general genre that called out to you in your youth?
I think writing more generally. I think it's a really great thing that I grew up in a time when Word documents were saved in physical pieces of floppy disks and stuff, because now they're all destroyed and I am not held accountable for all the terrible short stories I read. They're all gone now, but or the terrible short stories I wrote. So I think I was always a reader and always a writer, which is why it's such a thrill. I truly never thought that loving libraries and being a historian, loving public libraries and being a historian ever had a place together. I always thought reading and libraries were like a hobby thing, and a historian was more of, historian and curator is more of like what I did as a living. And the thought that you could do both is really exciting, because I was such a library kid. Like we lived in a place where you couldn't walk to the library. So I had to have someone drive me there. And I just was the most annoying kid, because I was always like, oh, that's on the way to the library. Could we stop? I just was always trying to find ways to go to the library.
What do you think it is about the library?
It's where the books live. Like, it's just, you get to go to the book's house.
That is the perfect tagline for libraries.
It's really
libraries.
sweet.
It's where the books live. I
It's
can already
where
see the commercial.
live. Yeah, a lovely community for books. But it's funny because obviously Nikki Giovanni just passed away. And in looking more into her life, I didn't realize that she wrote children's books. And she specifically wrote a children's book that's like an ode to the library and the memories of how much she loved her local library. I think she grew up in Ohio, Tennessee, wherever she grew up. She went to her local library a lot. And I went and bought up a bunch of copies of that book to give to the various kids in my life. And in reading the book and then giving it to them, I just thought a lot about how kids now, I mean, people talk a lot about screens and all the things they get to do, but so many of my nieces and my friends' kids, they still love a library. And I don't know what it is besides that's where the books live. And there's something, you get to go home with something, even if you don't have to pay for it. There's usually puzzles and stuff. It's a space that's designed with you in mind, especially when you're a kid. Most libraries have like a kids portion that has bright colors, maybe has some board puzzles. And I think just the experience of going somewhere that's built with you in mind, where you can walk away with something regardless of how much you can spend. And especially if you're a really bookish kid, that's your favorite thing. And it's a place designed around your favorite thing. And it really makes me happy that even in a world when kids have so many other options, they still love their libraries. And that book is really special because I think it taps into that. And I'm enjoying being around the kids in my life who are still would take a trip to the library over, Paw Patrol any day. Yeah.
It's something where it feels like also the tactile nature of it, the physical space of it. It kind of becomes like a representation of your brain, I feel like. When I go into the library, it's a feeling I used to get at video stores, but it's like, oh, I can wander through basically the different genres in my brain, and I can pick up a book that's like, oh, that's interesting, and it's in my hands. I'm feeling it, I'm thinking it. The combination of all that, I think sometimes that gets lost these days, where I can do an infinite number of things from one device, and you kind of lose track of the value of it in some way.
And I think there's also something nice, even when it's digital, because I do a ton of borrowing books, like ebooks and audiobooks from the library. The Libby app is like the thing I use most on my phone. And I think there's something nice about waiting your turn, like especially if a book is new and it's buzzy, that you get to put a hold in. And especially now, even though it's digital, you get a notification or you get an email like your book is ready for you. It's waiting, and you get to go kind of like have your turn with it. And so even when books were just physical, I would get really excited when, you would get, I think even then it was email, but you would get the notification that like your hold is ready for pickup, come get it. And I think even when I was younger too, I borrowed a lot of CDs from the library. I think that's where, because I'm from like a fairly suburban rural place, a lot of farms, there wasn't like the Virgin Megastore where I grew up. And so the public library was for sure where I got to expose myself to music from other cultures, or even like hip hop. Like we had Hot 97 when I grew up, which was a lot of New York based artists, but definitely the first time I heard an Outkast album, I borrowed it from the public library, or like the clips, because, they would be one copy for the entire system, and you'd wait your turn, and then you got your chance to listen to very regional stuff, or like even Shakira, someone singing in Spanish. Like I think the public library is also where I kind of expanded my sense that there was what was popular on like BET MTV, the radio, but then there was other stuff too, and you could get access to it. You had to wait, or you had to search for it, or even in some cases, like you request that the library get a copy. You put in the little please buy this copy for the entire system. But if they do, then you have access to it. So I think it was also my way of having access to more than just what was mass culture in front of me.
You mentioned that you were writing fiction, which kind of suggests that there was a section of the library that was your go-to in your youth.
Oh, yeah. There was not an unfortunate orphan that I didn't love, which is funny because I had two very loving, very present parents. But if there was a redheaded orphan that someone wrote a book about, I was certainly.
Are you a fan of Annie? Annie's one of my favorite movies of all time.
I loved Annie and read some of the comics. Anne of Green Gables. It's your Pippi Longstockings.
Yeah.
I loved a Heidi. There was Maura Ella Montgomery's was maybe like Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farms, like all of the misfortunate spunky orphans. I was just that was my genre, or just spunky heroines in general.
This feels like something we have to unpack then. You had two loving parents, yet you were obsessed with orphans. What was it about these orphan characters that you connected with?
Oh, I think in a lot of literature, especially a lot of it's made for girls, like obviously other people can identify with it as well. But I think there's just this sense of being plucky and being able to overcome your own circumstances that I think these are childhood classics for a reason. I think that it speaks to some degree of I can be, like spunky or charming or smart enough to just get my way out of my circumstances. And I think especially if you feel like your circumstances don't feel like the best place for you, there's a sense of like, oh, I can learn my way, talk my way, adventure my way into a completely new life for myself. And I think that's definitely, a trope in children's literature, or in a lot of like 19th century Victorian era literature more generally. But I think it spoke to me as someone who, was dying, dreaming of New York, dying to be in a big city, but was stuck in the kind of cornfields of New Jersey. I think definitely there's a way that your Annies and your Pippi Longstockings felt like kindred spirits.
Yeah, it's a very magical life story in a way.
Well, yeah, and I think it's funny because I feel like I meet a lot of adults now, and especially other women of my generation who have the same relationship with a lot of these heroines. And all of us came from very different life backgrounds, but I think there's something very universal about those stories. And it's funny because obviously the work I do now is not just history, but public history, where you're trying to make history accessible to as many people as possible. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is just thinking about, well, what makes a story universal? What makes a narrative compelling? And certainly there's some degree of, oh, I want to go to an exhibition about, Black artists in the Harlem Renaissance because that's something I really like myself or feel like I identify with. But there's also something about that larger story of migration or, adversity that no matter what your background is, you can kind of get into. And so I think I'm really drawn to stories that can be made universal, in part because I identified with so much of that as a kid, but it's kind of at the heart of what I do. Like what makes this particular history transcend its particular circumstance.
You're making me try and unpack why I loved The Little Orphan Annie so much as a kid.
And if it was the movie, that's some great music too.
It's some great music, Hard Knocks Life. But I do think that in my childhood brain wasn't necessarily thinking about race too much, but this curly-haired, red-headed orphan kind of was like, yeah, I was just like, I identify with you on a level that I don't identify with most characters. And in fact, I think that when they made, was it Jamie Foxx, they made that new one. I don't think that's one of those rare movies where no one complained about the recasting. No one complains about recasting Little Orphan Annie and making it. Well,
it's funny too because Annie is in some ways such a unique story of its time, but there's also a way that's like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That's like Silver Spoons. There's like a whole bunch of very beloved cultural productions that are about, the good things in life, the good life can just find you, and you can be airlifted into a mansion and millions and all of this, these servants and all of this life. I think that there's something very universal about kind of like someone can decide that you're special enough to be plucked out of your circumstance and like brought into, lifestyles of the rich and famous that I think really appeals to a lot of people. And just like, it could be you, that's why people play the lottery. Like maybe this is my chance.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, this being the land of immigrants, everyone's an orphan in some way. So maybe that, there's a unique American connection.
True. We're all looking for somewhere to belong and also for great dance numbers.
So you're writing fiction as a kid. What kind of fiction was it? Were you writing characters like the ones you're describing?
I'm so embarrassed to admit this, but it was basically just my favorite parts of books I would turn into an entire plot, which made them exceedingly boring because for instance, I loved the scene in Little Women where Meg goes to Sally's house, and she, not unlike Annie, she's exposed to a life of fancy dresses and good times. And the book is supposed to make you believe that like that's all an illusion. Like her, it's not as good as it's made out to be. But little 9-year-old me was just kind of like silk dresses, fancy parties. Let's make a whole book that's just people wearing silk dresses and going to fancy parties, and everyone's beautiful and everyone's life sparkles. And I would just write long, like pages, like 100 pages about
describing
like one party.
The sparkles.
100%. The different colors the dresses were, and all the way everyone's hair looked, and everyone has, cool things to eat. I just loved those scenes. There's this whole like Twitter account that's like the different way that food is described in Redwall. And I was definitely doing stuff like that, where it'd just be like the feast scene in one particular book, which will last a couple pages. And I would write entire long chapters about like, and then this thing happened in the same feast, and then dessert came out. Like I just love to make a party scene into a whole book, just description after description after description.
Well, this level of description, it seems like you were saying your first official pursuit was journalism. Would you consider that, or was it something else?
No, I mean, I wrote my share of terrible juvenile poetry, but definitely I thought I was going to be a journalist. So I did little journalism, like minority journalism camps. And I was on my school newspaper. I really thought that, I think it's because when you're a kid who likes to write, that's one of the only things you can imagine is either being a writer. And I think at some point I just knew that being a writer wasn't for me. Cause I've also always liked jobs. Like I like having an office. I like having a boss. I really like the structure of a job, but I also liked writing, and journalism felt like something that you could do both of. And especially growing up as a kid in the 90s, there were so many journalists that were just on TV or in the paper. And I just thought that they were really held up as heroes. I mean, this was like, Oprah was a thing. And, on CNN, you had is his name Michael Stewart? Like, these people who are doing hard hitting journalism. And it seemed like that was an important thing for somebody to do. And I still think that's true. It's just harder now. Everyone I know who's a journalist is not having a great time. I
would love to see, and that trailer for the new Superman movie just came out, and I would love to see a truly authentic rendition of Clark Kent being a journalist in
in today's
2025.
It would just be like, this conglomerate has bought your newspaper and they're doing layoffs, just like 5 scenes of that in a row.
Yeah, and it would be Lex Luthor owns the newspaper. I don't know if they've ever done that. It would be
so depressing, but it's so true. No, it really makes me sad because, especially being a historian, and it's funny because my dissertation was about the 1970s, but actually find myself doing 19th century history quite a lot. It's like the 1800s. And it's why we have history. I mean, if you have no newspapers, it's so hard to write with certainty about anything. Just we rely on someone to be able to report on what's happening, to document what's going on. And the state that journalism is in now is really unfortunate because not only is it that it's harder and harder to make a living doing journalism, but it really terrifies me that certain sites will go down and just take their archive with them. The archivists I work with here at the Center for Brooklyn History have often talked about, for instance, the blog era in Brooklyn, like the early 2000s, like, I don't know, 1999 to maybe 2009, there was an absolute blossoming of like Blogspot and, GeoCities, like small independent blogs that many of them are just wiped off the internet. I mean, this is before a lot of like Internet Archive and other places were sweeping sites.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of those pieces of writing, the work that people were doing, the photos they were taking are just gone. And as a historian, it's like the Library of Alexandria, on fire every day, just the way that things, if no one saved them, they're really in danger of being lost forever, and the historians of the future won't have them.
Adding to that, I've been rereading Fahrenheit 451, which is one of my favorite
Do you know
books.
I've never read it?
I think you would love it.
I was never assigned it, and I was just chatting with a coworker about how there are a lot of like classic novels that are a lot of people's favorites that I would love to go back and read, because they're classics for a reason. And certainly, the Brooklyn Public Library is really committed to this Books Unbanned initiative and making sure people have access to books and stopping the tide of censorship. And so that's often the urtext of that whole conversation. So
yeah,
to get back into it.
And Bradbury had a similar passion for libraries as you, and in fact wrote the book in a library. Like one of those like pay typewriters. So I'd just like 10 cents per hour or something like that. So I've always loved that story. But you describing how you were writing these, you would pinpoint an element of a book and you would obsess over this party, and then you would write pages upon pages of Word documents elaborating on it.
Yes.
It feels like, and you describing it before you told me this as boring, it feels like these are the train tracks leading you towards journalism and then towards being a historian.
Oh, 100%. It's funny because a lot of professional historians, it really is just following a particular passion. And if you really are into something quite boring, you can do it for quite a while. I mean, that's part of the process. And sometimes it gets lost in the editing, but you kind of, a lot of historians kind of have the privilege of going after the stories that they just happen to be super interested in. Now, some people are motivated by something that feels urgent to them, or a story that hasn't been told and needs to be told, or has been told maybe with a bias that they want to correct. There are lots of reasons why people pick the topics they pick, but a lot of people just write at great length about things that they're really passionate about. And so it does make sense that someone's just like, I like this one thing and I'm just going to write a ton about it. That is often what a historian's work looks like, especially when you're going through the research phase and you're trying to just like find out. Everyone's process is different, but a lot of people just take pages and pages of notes. And also I think the work of getting into, in this case, like a fictional character's head, but taking a moment and really panning out, like, well, what else was happening then? Or what are the other factors that might have led to this transpiring the way it transpired? Because oftentimes what we're doing is looking at one newspaper article that says, this fight happened on Tuesday morning, and you might go in and say, well, what was the weather like that day? Or, what was the job, what was unemployment looking like? Because there's so many reasons why some big event might tip off, and it's not just, it was it was that day and time and there's no explanation for it. Sometimes it's like, well, it was really hot, or there was a strike going on, and there were all these other things that can lead to whatever the event was, that being the powder keg moment. You really have to zoom out and say, well, what led to that powder keg? And I think getting really into a particular story and just being like, oh, this is what interests me. You want to learn everything about it. You want to see it from every angle. And that obsessiveness definitely makes for particular kinds of history. Because some people, all history looks different. But that obsessiveness for, I want to know everything about why this moment looked the way it looked, I think that definitely tracks.
Don't scroll away. You Are the Genre. We'll be right back after the break. Here we are in the middle of the episode where I remind you that You Are the Genre is a listener-supported podcast, which means I do this for the love of great conversation, but also the joy of bringing those conversations to the masses. That's you. And if you'd like to support the show in any additional way, there's a few ways you can do that. You can leave a nice rating or review wherever you're listening to it right now. That really helps get other people on our radar. And you can also subscribe to the newsletter associated with the podcast. There's a link to that in your show notes or at youarethegenre.com. You can subscribe for a free newsletter subscription, which gives you updates on the latest publicly available episodes, plus other things, personal insights, stuff like that. But you can also upgrade to a paid subscription to the newsletter, which gives you access to advanced episodes of the podcast, advanced features of the newsletter, and so much more. I also use this break in the middle of the show to talk about something that I've simply been enjoying. And you know what? This month, it has been a great show on a little platform that you can download for free and watch for free called Pluto TV. I promise you that I'm not being paid to promote Pluto TV as much as I believe I should, because I bring up Pluto TV way too much. Pluto TV is it's free TV, but they got all these little channels, just like a Doctor Who channel. There's a Johnny Carson channel. And this month I discovered that a classic sitcom that hasn't been available on any streaming platform for decades. I believe all of the seasons weren't even available on DVD for decades. It's The Drew Carey Show. Now, The Drew Carey Show doesn't hold up 100% in terms of our modern eyes, but it holds up just enough. You know what I mean? So there you go. Watch The Drew Carey Show on Pluto TV, and leave a nice rating review on the podcast, and consider subscribing to the newsletter. If you'd like to do that, get all of the information you need at youarethegenre.com. Now, back to the episode. Where were we? Do you feel that you are sort of pointing the camera at a different direction at the same party that's been covered before?
Oftentimes, yeah. I think there's some well, it depends, because, for instance, I have an exhibition coming out in January on the history of slavery in Brooklyn. And that's really interesting because, on the one hand, I think a lot of people have no idea that there was slavery in Brooklyn. And it's brand new information that, like, yes, for, almost 2 centuries, plantation agricultural slavery took place in Brooklyn, and you had people working in fields who were kidnapped and working against their will. Like, that happened. And that's
I live in Ditmas Park. Was some of that going on here? How's that vibe?
I think so, actually. I think it's most of Brooklyn. Because Brooklyn was actually, by ratio, there were the ratio of enslaved people to enslavers was only higher in Charleston. Like, Brooklyn was a huge capital for slavery. But so a lot of what we now just know is, like Flatbush or all these other places were major sites for slavery. So it's brand new information on the one hand. Then you have other people who knew that slavery happened in New York, but assumed that it was like domestic slavery. So yeah, there are people who maybe knew that there was slavery in New York and in Brooklyn, but assumed that it was like domestic slavery. Like, people were living in the house and were enslaved servants. And sometimes that's true, but there was also plantation slavery in Brooklyn. And I think there's some people who knew it existed in Brooklyn, but maybe not specifically the locations. Or one of the things the exhibition gets into, your point about looking from a different angle, is not just the existence of slavery, but how the wealth inequality that we still see in Brooklyn ties directly back to slavery. Or some of the same names of families that enslaved people in Brooklyn are in our subway stops, like the Bergen family or the Lefferts family. These are names that we know as street names, subway stops, neighborhood names, but these are some of the same families that were directly enslaving people, violently keeping people from freedom. And so it's the vantage point of just like, well, how does this relate to wealth inequality? How does this relate to land ownership? How does this relate to indigenous history? There's a number of different vantage points that where I think better able to storytell around now. We have different methods, we have different information. So no matter what your level of knowledge is coming at this history, the hope is that you'll still have something new to learn, whether that's a new fact, whether that's a new vantage point, whether that's a new set of questions, because the exhibition is also about family genealogy history and the way people research their own families, and specifically Black people researching their own families and getting around questions about, my family wasn't literate until this time period, so we didn't have written records, or the Great Migration created a particular break in the family history. And so navigating how to research your family history when Black history looks a lot different in this country. So maybe that's just giving you a new set of questions to ask your parents when you visit them. So hopefully there's a little bit of looking at things from multiple angles, but also bringing you in at the ground level if that's where you're at.
I feel like I could have a whole separate podcast about all this stuff. But I'm becoming more and more obsessed with that aspect of my history. And being from LA, I never really thought about any concept of Great Migration.
Have you not read The Warmth of Other Suns? Let me rephrase
Okay.
that. That's a weird way of putting it. You need to read The Warmth of Other Suns. I mean, it like won the Pulitzer, it won all these awards, and it earned it. It's a beautiful book. But I researched Black history like for a living. I knew a lot of it. The way that Isabel Wilkerson specifically talks about the Great Migration in California makes so much of that make more sense. Like if there's one place to learn more about that, I would definitely say it's The Warmth of Other Suns. Like there's this epic part of the book where a family is literally driving from, I think, Louisiana all the way to California and like can't stop because it's not safe to stop anywhere. So they just have to like drive through the night and there's nowhere to stop and eat or pee or anything. And that sense of like how, you don't just arrive in California, especially as a Black person. Like there has to be someone making a pretty significant decision that there is a future for them there. And I've literally never, like even that book came out maybe like 5 years ago or more. But even all of this that's been happening with like Kendrick Lamar and the Pop-Off and really thinking about LA Black culture and celebrating it in a way that we haven't done in a long time. It's very Southern and it's also very distinct. It's like the people from these particular parts of the South, like it's usually Louisiana,
Mississippi, maybe, because that's the two sides of my family,
Exactly. Like it's in New York, people tend to move from Georgia and the Carolinas. In California, it's much more of like Louisiana, Kentucky, the kind of more west part of the South. And so not only is it the deeply Southern, but also like the particular people who left the South, because people have been in California for a long time and they've created their own culture out there. And literally, I was like watching the Pop-Off and I was just kind of like, wow. All I could think about was The Warmth of Other Suns and the Great Migration. And like, look what you guys built. You left a sure thing and headed out into the unknown. And now this whole new generation is screaming from the top of their lungs. Like there's something distinct about our culture. We are Black from Compton, and that is different from being Black from Oakland or Black from New York. And it's really beautiful when you think about, what people created for themselves out there.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing that none of this is that long ago, yet we have created these different factions, these different variations of Blackness, and to the point that we have fights about it.
Oh, yeah. And it shows you how fast you can like create a culture. I was listening to an episode of another Pop-Off. It's been a minute, but from NPR, and Brittany Luce had a guest that was talking about how hip hop in LA is coming out of a car because people get around by cars, and so the beats that are going to make the most sense for people to like play really hard are the ones that sound good in like a slow moving vehicle. Whereas in New York, you're either sitting in the park and listening to a boombox, or you're like going through the subway, and it just has the tempo needs to feel different to match the pace of life. And I'd never thought about like why Too Short sounds like that as opposed to why Tribe sounds like that, and connecting those dots of like, how do you move around those cities was like, oh, wow, that creates a completely different kind of sound, from the sound of the beat to even how you talk, like the pace of how people are rapping. How you move around your city or your space directly translates to what the music sounds like. And it kind of blew my mind. I feel
like I'm somehow turning this about me, but it's just me trying to get to a more genuine question here. But being from LA, I was pretty sheltered, and I have this weird disconnect with locational pride. I don't understand it. But the closest I got to it was when I was in Chicago. And I think that it's because public transportation, there's a reason, there's more reasons to go outside. You'll go from your car somewhere, you go into the train, that kind of thing. But also things move slower than they do in New York. And this is from, at this point, like 10 years ago. But when I got to New York, things constantly were moving so fast, I had no sense of place whatsoever. The closest place I've ever had to locational pride is Chicago, because it was like coming of age, wanted to get into comedy, doing all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, things felt semi-stable. Like this location will always kind of be like this. The segregation is so specific.
And And New York, you can't bank on any of that. Your favorite, I mean, there's a segment of people who might listen to this who will get this. Like my neighborhood bagel store just closed, Absolute Bagels, and people are losing their minds. Like the signs on the door, like, please come back, we'll do anything. Because like you never know. And they just closed abruptly. People woke up one day and they're like, we're closed for good. And so like the things that feel like institutions in your neighborhood can be taken from you at the drop of a hat in New York, which does lead to a certain kind of sense that like nothing's certain. Whereas, yeah, from what I understand about Chicago is like there's a lot more of like stability you can expect, whether it's the segregation or whether it's businesses, you can expect to see the same thing when you go back to a certain part.
Yeah. The first neighborhood I moved to in Chicago is like right next to White Sox Stadium. And I moved there. Everyone, when I would go to stores, people would be like, we've changed. And I was like, what are you talking? Like, this area used to be like the most racist white neighborhood ever. But the fact that people were like, and I could still feel that.
Yeah. I will say, and maybe this is blasphemy as a New Yorker, I love how much Chicago people, like all they are is pride. Like no one has ever been happier to be where they are at than someone from Chicago. Like, and it's the thing they love most about themselves is that they're from Chicago. Whereas I think a lot of New Yorkers like to complain. Like their New York pride is just like absolutely complaining about the place that they're proud to be from.
What you're going to be presenting or what you're focused on right now, revealing the history or, researching the history of slavery in Brooklyn. I feel like that same presentation in Chicago, I would be able to pinpoint people who feel a very direct connection to that. Whereas like in Brooklyn, I wonder if because of the intense melting pot nature, the intense gentrification, do you feel like at sometimes you're preaching to a constantly move like the choir's on a train?
I think a little bit, but in a way that is nice because I do think that since so many people are always moving here and moving away and the demographics are always shifting, sometimes people are looking for a way to feel rooted. And it's helpful to kind of be like the ground on which you stand produced this. And here's a little bit about like Flatbush and why it came to be the way that it is. And, understanding that maybe helps you to understand your place in the, constantly evolving chain of characters that come in and out that makes Flatbush what it is and what it was. So there's part of it that's that. But as a kind of spoiler, I don't know when this episode comes out, but at the center of the exhibition, we actually have, we commissioned a portrait of a woman who was descended from one of the enslaved people that lived in Flatbush. And she grew up in Bed-Stuy. And I think that's also helpful to kind of say like, yes, there are so many people who just got here or whose family moved here and they moved away and, their history is one of transience, but there's also people who have been here since forever. This is her entire family's lineage was Brooklyn, 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 leading all the way back to slavery. And so I think that's helpful too, because it's empowering for people to know that we have always been here. We're not just, as newly arrived as anybody else, that our roots here are in some ways just as, if not more legitimate than anyone else's. And I think that sense, that you do have culture and you do have rootedness and it's right here in a place like Brooklyn. I think that's really valuable for people to even know that it exists, let alone if that is your experience to be able to connect to. Because otherwise, like, I think it's easy to feel as though, well, this city doesn't care if I leave or stay. It's like, no, well, this city has always been a home for people like you or for these people. And, rootedness is possible here. And so I like making that point. And that's why we kind of made the effort of getting her portrait painted. And we're going to have it juxtaposed next to an oil portrait of the family that enslaved her ancestor as a way of kind of saying there are certain people who have always been able to afford oil portraits and have their names, recognized as trailblazers in this city. But if your family's history has not been lifted up in quite the same way, it's not too late. We're going to lift it up. You've also built this city and it's time you're recognized for it.
That's beautiful. You mentioned briefly that you dabbled in poetry. Is it something that...
No, this was bad juvenile poetry. I appreciate poetry now. Like like many people, Nikki Giovanni just passed, and so I've been diving into her poetry, and whenever there's like a birthday or an event that someone's grieving, I like to kind of find a poem to kind of send to them to go along with it. But it's fallen out as my favorite medium. I'm definitely like a nonfiction girly through and through. I'm never not reading some big fat history of either a person or a place, especially about Black history. I think that both in writing and in reading, I'm all about history at the moment. But history can be very poetic. There are a lot of history writers that are just write so beautifully and lyrically. So there's plenty of poetry to be found in history too.
I think it's like journalism, history. I think there's a way to look at those pursuits as like pushing away from the self. So that's why it makes me interested in this early pursuit in poetry. It feels very centered within you. Like even the short stories you're writing, they weren't focused on you. They were focused on exploring these fictional scenarios.
Well, it's funny too, because I think public history and specifically like making exhibitions, it almost calls out for poetry in a way that reminds me of if you speak another language but not well, you end up speaking very poetically because you don't have the vocabulary. So there's a lot of like, I would like to go to the place where the sleep is made, because you've forgotten the word for bedroom or whatever it is. And I feel similarly about exhibition text, where you have to really land on a good descriptive word sometimes, because that one word needs to do what a paragraph would if you had space for a paragraph. And so we used to work with a lovely exhibition writer when I was at the New York Historical Society. All love to Marjorie Waters. She's amazing. And she would coach us on like using German verbs and not Latin verbs, because German verbs are more active and they keep people engaged. So there's a way that the same attention that I think a poet has for language and crafting the perfect word, kind of de facto you have to use when you're writing for an exhibition, because you have a character and word limit, you have space limitations, you're trying to get people to look at the archival element or the photograph or whatever the actual history piece is. The caption is secondary. And so balancing all of those things, you need to have the same kind of reverence and attention to language as a poet would. But the goal isn't always to be beautiful. The goal is to be effective and efficient. So sometimes it's not beauty, but beauty's nice too. It's nice to sometimes, really capture people with a well-turned phrase.
Do you feel that there's any connective tissue between some of the things that you're talking about in your poetry with what you're inspired to research now? Or was it really just pure, angst, It
was a lot. No, I don't think so. I think it's just storytelling. I don't think I'm like moved by the poetics of much, so much as I just think there's like good stories. Like I'm desperate to do an exhibition on Puerto Rican history in Brooklyn, because I don't think that we've adequately or we've honored that history as much as we should, because Puerto Rico is such an important part of Brooklyn's history, especially as like a port. Its relationship with the city of San Juan is so important. So in any case, it's more of just what history do I think is needed, is urgent, is applicable than anything else. I think it's more of just what history, almost like using history like a medication, like, oh, the city needs this. Let's do this kind of history because we're in need of this kind of healing. Let's do that.
Nice. This kind of healing. So you feel like you're healing in some way, a part of the psyche of the city.
Yeah, or at least healing the fact that we don't know enough about the place we live. I think that is a wound, and I think history is the perfect dressing for that wound of just like, what was this place? What does it matter who came before us, or who came before us, and what do we owe them? I think that is definitely a wound to be healed, and I'm constantly, in that realm.
What is your relationship to that first pursuit? You can describe it as your first pursuit being those stories or journalism. Like, how do you feel when you think back on that now?
I definitely think thinking I was going to be a journalist shaped me to be a historian, because it's the asking of the question. It's the having the curiosity, and it's forming the right question and going to the right source for that question. I think those are, the building blocks of a good journalist. And I also think it's the building blocks of a good historian, that you have a curiosity and enough training to know how to satisfy that curiosity, with maybe the added step of crafting a narrative to make that curiosity accessible and inviting and enticing, the storytelling piece of it. Because as journalists, you have the inverted triangle, you put the important part up top, and then everything else is just kind of less important because, you got to get everything in the lead. Whereas a historian can play around a little bit with narrative structure, and that's the fun part. But certainly the curiosity and the question is the relationship that is still what guides literally what I do every day.
As mediums shift, it feels like journalism and being a historian is shifting as well. I often think like, oh wait, do you have to go to college to be a journalist? Do you have to go to college to be a historian?
I definitely, I make a face because it's like a big debate, like who gets to call themselves a historian. Like for some people, they'll say like, well, I don't have a PhD, so I'm not a historian. And then you have other people who are like, well, no, I looked something up on Wikipedia. I am a historian. And I don't think I have a super big opinion. I think if someone calls themselves a historian and they feel like that describes them, that's great. And if someone has a degree in history, but is like, doesn't do any active history and isn't curious about history, they just like want to be a professor because it sounds cool. Then like, I'm not invested in you being a historian. So, it's not so much the training. I think the training does help. I think being deeply immersed in lots of history helps because, you have to know what you're talking about. There's a lot of just facts that you need to know in order to be informed enough to ask good questions. Yeah. But I don't think that needs to happen through training for sure.
Yeah. And as like, we were talking about like Superman and the newspaper, as newspapers potentially fade, the need to write in a certain way, it feels like, the blogosphere of it all is becoming the norm. So a new system has to emerge for how we value and validate. Yeah.
And how we reach people without getting, it's a whole other long thing that we probably can't get into, but it is true that people are getting more of their information on like short form video. And that's a shame because literacy matters, but also if someone is only ever going to watch a minute long video, are you just going to have them not know any history because you're not going to give them a high quality 1 minute video because that's not what you were trained to do? I don't happen to agree with that. I think if people want history and they want videos, I hope there are people making great history videos so they can learn something. I think it's much less important what the medium is and more important that there's curiosity, that there's rigor. You want to get good information, but that you're getting questions answered and you're telling good stories. That can happen in lots of ways. It could be big, fat 400-page books, and it can also be TikTok videos, and it can also be chatting with your older relatives at Thanksgiving. Like that can look a lot of different ways. And having a broad definition of history means that more people feel empowered to get involved. And all for that, literally.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for doing the show.
Of course. I'm sorry I had to cut it short.
I don't want you to get locked in there or whatever it seems
It's happened. It's awful. It's very embarrassing. It's very hard for them to get me to leave the building, and it means I get locked in, and that's not great. Although, come on, being locked in a library is also a childhood. Yeah.
And that's the show. Big thanks to Dominique Jean-Louis for joining me on the podcast. For more information about her, visit the Center for Brooklyn History's website or just visit the Center for Brooklyn History. Freddie Nunez created and sings the You Are the Genre theme song, and Adam Smith produced it. This is Tim Barnes signing off with your weekly reminder that you are the genre.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do? I'd like to know the things that specifically make